All right, so this is a talk on experiential computing and the future of text. So my first experience with virtual reality, probably, I've been thinking about this, probably happened when I was probably about 6 years old. And our neighbor, who was a salesman, gave my brother and myself a set of plastic toy dinosaurs, and I would spend hours and hours and hours taking them on stories and adventures and making up all kinds of narratives with my dinosaurs. And then when I was probably about 10 or 11, I discovered Harold, and that inspired me to think that, oh, you can actually just create whatever world you want. And then when I was 16, I saw Fantasia, and then that completely expanded my consciousness. And I said, that's what I want to do when I grow up. And in fact, their dinosaurs moved. And then about 5 years after that, I worked on the movie Tron. I realized that working with computer graphics in 1981 was not the same as what I had seen made in 1940 with Fantasia. So I started developing techniques to try to make computer graphics more interesting. I developed procedural techniques, what are now called computer shaders, the idea of running a complete program at every pixel. And that combined text and art in interesting new ways. And then eventually those techniques made their way to making even better dinosaurs. This is seen from Jurassic Park. Then I joined NYU, where I worked on all sorts of things. I fled industry for the safety of academia. I developed the first zoomable interfaces, which has apparently become a thing. I did all sorts of crazy experiments, like I discovered playing with 3D printing. So I said, how could you print 4 dimensions? In fact, how could you print 5 dimensions? So this is a tumbling hypercube. So I guess that's 4 dimensions plus 1 projected down to 4. That's a 5-dimensional object. And then eventually I founded a lab that was specifically about trying to look at what would be everyone's shared experience of the future. I was reacting to the fact that VR is a thing where you put on this headset and you go off into your own space and you're disconnected from the physical world around you and the people in the same room. And this reiterates the historical experience of Edison's kinetoscope, which really didn't catch on. And it wasn't until the Lumiere brothers put everybody in a big room with other human beings that movies became the dominant medium of the early 20th century. And it's because people really like to gather with each other. It's instinctive. It's part of our survival as a species. We did a whole bunch of experiments at NYU in which we put people in the same physical room and shared virtual worlds. Probably our biggest was in 2018, which we first showed at SIGGRAPH, and then at the Tribeca Film Festival, we had 30-something people experience the same virtual theater piece together, but the people could all see each other and hear each other as avatars. And we showed that to several thousand people at SIGGRAPH, and then several thousand more people in Vancouver. And the idea was to see what could you have as a VR experience that was socially shared, so it could be experienced eventually by hundreds of millions of people. Well, meanwhile, in 2006, I had read Rainbow's End, a science fiction story that influenced me very deeply. The basic idea is it's 40 years in the future. Everyone wakes up in the morning, pops in their contact lenses, and they can see whatever they want. And this might seem a little fanciful until you think about Gordon's Moore's prediction, Moore's law, he made in 1963, which turned out to be quite prescient, which is that computer power doubles roughly every 18 months in one way or another. And if you just start taking this and thinking about it, then this is what the future of VR is very likely to look like. And in fact, we can dive down into some details. Anything I can put on my head that's essentially like an Android phone which is what an Oculus Quest is, et cetera, et cetera. I can only get a few watts of power. But if I can plug something in the wall, that's 300 watts of power. That's 10 years in the future from whatever I can put on my on my head. Fortunately, fast wireless is coming. We're only in the era of 5G now, but in another 10 years, we'll have 6G. So we're going to go from 3 gigahertz to 100 gigahertz. And when that happens, basically, most of the computation is going to be happening not on your headset, but on something plugged into the wall. So you'll be wearing some very, very lightweight thing that looks just like a pair of glasses, but not just the graphics, but the vision, the machine learning, the gesture recognition, the object recognition, all of the smart stuff is going to be happening basically in the cloud. And that's going to change the nature of reality. We will have virtual objects that we just accept as part of the built world, and we won't even think about it. Just the way, as creatures of text, when we go to a restaurant now and open up a menu and we look at the text on the menu, we don't think that's amazing. We just think that's normal, even though, of course, any non-literate creature wouldn't understand why we're staring at cardboard to order food. Similarly, there will be creatures that will exist in the world, and we'll just accept them and interact with them as though they're part of our built world, because they will be. People will have face-to-face conversations in which whatever they want will be floating between them, and there'll be new kinds of interfaces that have very low cognitive load that will just be around us. So instead of menus, we're going to be and there are dystopian scenarios. We don't want to recreate this for everybody. We want to have the ability to have calm interfaces, as opposed to just saying, when I have to put on my glasses, just as today people have to have their smartphones, and yet everybody's advertising at me. So ideally, and by the way, everything I'm showing you is a live demo. Ideally, I want to be able to just sketch out a creature, and the fact that I drew that creature means the creature is in my world. Maybe it wants to eat my plants, interacts with things, etc. And we want to have that kind. And I was heavily influenced by reading in 1993 Steven Pinker's book, The Language Instinct, where he pulls together work by many, many people on evolutionary linguistics. So, for example, we learned that children up to the age of 7 invent language. Language is evolved by children. And when you think about this, it makes sense, because if anything that's not learnable by children up to 7 cannot be passed on. So children actually evolve language, not grown-ups. And then I learned about things like Nicaraguan Sign Language, studied by Ann Sengas and others, where you see a generation of children, deaf children, evolve grammar before everyone's eyes, learning how to create more interesting visual constructs to create more and more complex recombinatorial syntax, which is only found in nature and natural languages and DNA, as one of the earlier speakers pointed out. So I started playing around with these ideas. What would a future visual language look like? And this is this thing called Choctaw, where I basically say, okay, so you have this idea of nouns, and because the nouns have a certain quality, they move, but maybe the way you draw this thing, so I'm drawing this live now, changes the way it moves, and you can tie things together and ask questions. I use it to teach science and computer graphics. So for example, here, this is a pendulum, and I can also find out, like, oh, what is it about this pendulum that is interesting? And it's that it has actually a sort of decayed sine function. But notice that, again, in terms of adjectives, or adverbs, if I draw this thing differently, it's the same object, but it now has different physics. And I can tell entire stories with this. So for example, let's say I wanted to talk about energy conservation. So we have an idea of light. We have an idea of a motion sensor, and I can tie the motion sensor to the light. This is the part of the talk where I do a little bit of hand waving. So I can have a hand, and if the hand moves in front of this, and all that's going on here is code that anybody can edit. And as you edit this code, different things happen, and you can create different sorts of objects. Just to sort of sum up, by the way, one nice thing is that computers are now millions of times faster than when I first developed procedural textures. So now these procedural textures can happen in real time. This is the same sort of texture I made to make that marble vase. But now it's running many, many times a second, and people can do real-time design with this. The software hasn't changed. It's just that the computers have gotten faster and faster and faster. So to sum up, I feel as though language is going to evolve. And I think about little 6-year-old me, and in the future, when kids are able to create and evolve language using a visual component, what's going to be normal everyday reality is going to basically be like what we today might think of as Harry Potter meets Harold and the Purple Crayon. And I'm hoping that we can all help to make that future of text happen. Thanks. Questions, discussion?
Sure, there's a long line, so I don't want to presume. But that's
well, that was wonderful, and you were muted, so you didn't hear the applause from here. But yes, there is a long line. But Ellen, please go ahead.
Oh well, I've seen you demo Chalk Talk, Ken, for, many years ago, and I love it, and it's been a probably a cornerstone of what I try to build towards and think about. It's interesting in the context of GPT-3, seeing the demo again and realizing, oh, this is like prompt engineering before prompt engineering, which kind of got me thinking around do you imagine a version of, to a general audience, of drawing with Chalk Talk, but the response, the translation is wrong? You know, the ball, the pendulum is not what you had in mind, right? Would there be a way to, I guess in the DALL-E world, you could say, like, regenerate the image, try again? What are the other possible near matches?
Well, I think language is a funny thing because, and this was hard for me to wrap my head around as I started thinking about it, we are all experts. Children are learning machines that are specifically good at learning natural language. In fact, natural language is, by definition, the thing that children learn really well. You try to teach kids Esperanto and they will spontaneously fix it because it's not a natural language. It doesn't match the way their brains want to learn. And so what Chalk Talk is trying to do in a way is suggest, when you have whatever is the future language that everybody knows. Oh, somebody go thing. All right. Then what will be the feeling of that kind of conversation? So clearly I'm an expert at this, you know, I know what the vocabulary is, but I'm trying to imagine a world where everybody is in on the conversation. What's astonishing is that every single person on this conversation can spontaneously, with no cognitive load, put together a grammatically correct sentence that's never been uttered before. And we just take that as the base of human experience. So I'm not too worried about people making mistakes and having errors, because that's part of how people talk. You know, somebody says, you know, somebody misforms a sentence and creates an accidental pun. Okay, that's just part of the conversation.
So I just a quick follow on that then, because that's interesting. That using the metaphor of speaking and creating a language and language evolving, 100% on board with. When it comes to drawing the language, writing it out, I guess, how much is there's our hand a kind of intonation versus a kind of language? Like when we sketch something, we all sort of sketch arrows differently, right? Is that like a figure of a way of speaking that differentiates us? Is it kind of like a voice, or do you see that the hand being an essential part of this new evolved language? Does that make sense?
One of the things that I do know, a number of people have studied this, is that the centers of our brain that control hand manipulation are very strongly tied to the parts of our brain where we use the word articulation for both verbal language and our hands. And in fact, there are theories that the parts that are the language parts evolved out of parts that we'd already used for prehensile manipulation. So, and in fact, everybody that you watch that speaks, they just automatically start moving their hands.
Right.
So there already is a very strong connection, and I think if you look at the beauty of what's been created in non-hearing communities with sign languages, which are incredible. I mean, there's this wonderful power of simultaneity that we don't have as serial speakers. That I think we can all move toward that.
Thank you.
So I remember I tried ChalkTalk, I think in 2019 when you presented it at NYHR and released it on GitHub. And I remember cardboard mode, but I don't remember trying it in VR, namely that you would, let's say, pinch in the air to start to do the same shapes and then be in immersive mode. Even though it is web-based, so I'm wondering, have you tried that before? If not, wasn't it interesting? And if you haven't tried it, why not?
Well, we've ported in our lab at NYU, we've ported ChalkTalk to socially shared VR. And we just look at it as one of the aspects of the many research questions about sharing virtual and extended worlds together. I mean, we don't focus entirely on the language question, but it is one of the things that we look at. So it's in there, but we also look at, for example, asymmetries in scale and how do you use virtual characters as agents, and there are just lots and lots and lots of the relationship between tangible objects and their virtual proxies. But one of the things we do look at is gestures as semantic creation.
Thank you for the talk and for the presentation on ChalkTalk. I'm curious as to the extent of the utility that you found in real experiments with ChalkTalk. I recall Ivan Sutherland talking in the 90s about Sketchpad in the 60s, saying that ultimately it only really had two uses. One was to present the graphics for his thesis, and the other was to draw some hexagons for his mother, and he never asked why she wanted them. And the limitations being that a lot of things need representations or meta representations that he wasn't able to come up with a graceful representation for. How do you find, have you tried, and how do you find scaling ChalkTalk and what ends up being representable and where it ends up softer?
Well, the big secret to ChalkTalk is that, and this, I got this insight from I got to meet my one and only hero who just like awes me, which is Randall Munroe, who does XKCD. I asked him what he thought about, and he suggested ChalkTalk, and he said, draw the simplest possible thing. So what I found was the big insight was I go up to, I want to say, oh, I want to draw a planet, or I want to draw a person, or I want to draw a duck. I go up to a whiteboard and make the simplest possible drawing. And I find that that's the right visual representation to start. And behind that, I can put whatever code I want. I mean, I believe Sketchpad was very pure. It was doing everything. I mean, Ivan Sutherland was doing everything through this very pure system of constraints. And ChalkTalk is really a hodgepodge of techniques. It's really a way of sort of having an interface without apps, so that instead of here's an app and here's an app, everything can talk to everything else. So I'd say I'm not running into the same limitations he was running into, because I'm not trying to make something pure. I'm just basically trying to make something to present ideas for people. And if I have a new idea, I program it, I come up with some simple representation. I have ways of morphing things. And I think he was going for something much more idealistic in 1968 than what I'm going for. So it's maybe a little apples and oranges.
Hi, thank you so much for this. This was wonderful. I have a question. Are you thinking of
It's 4 p.m.
Are you thinking of this tool more in the sense of a cognitive tool or a communication tool? And I'll try to qualify that. I've been reading a bunch of Barbara Tversky's studies, and two of them come to mind that might be relevant in this context. One, she she found out that when people are presented with a process or a mechanism that they need to understand, when she asked them to use gestures to mimic the movements of the process of the mechanism, they learn better. And also when she asked them to sketch out the steps involved, they also learn better. But she also has a study on animations. And she actually found that where people were shown an animation when all the parts are moving, it ended up not helping as much as they thought it would. So there seems to be something about either the internal movement of the mind trying to understand, or a movement of the body trying to help the mind move and understand, versus the low-hanging fruit of just being given the movement that seemed to be quite advantageous in terms of from a cognitive perspective. And I believe Barbara is in the audience, so this is more also a prompt for her to step forward and correct my interpretation of her work. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm a big fan, of course, of Barbara Traversi's work, and I've learned a lot from reading her papers and having conversations with her. And I think it strongly informs what we do. As I mentioned in the previous answer, Chalk Talk is, or one of the earlier answers, Chalk Talk is just a component of the kinds of questions we like to ask in our lab. And the question of embodiment, and in fact, shared embodiment between multiple people is really important. And, you know, all of her work, not just on that you cited, but also the use of deictics, like when I'm in the same room with somebody, as she and her students showed, you can say this or that or then, or, you know, refer to things implicitly. And because things are embodied and you have gesture and eye gaze, etc., you're able to use language in this more implicit way, which is very, very powerful. So we're hoping that everything that we do will lead to a trajectory where people are in their bodies and using the full power of language, which is meant to be used together. We evolved to be used together with the physical embodied human in the same room. And I temporarily being stuck on Zoom is doing a terrible disservice to our power as humans, because who am I looking at right now? We are really, really good at integrating language with attention direction. And I think once the technology catches up to the studies that she's doing, we're going to get a lot more out of these communicative technologies.